Hello and welcome to A Theory of Everything. I'm Luis Razo, the director of EISM and host of this channel. Today I'm talking to Dr. Richard Heyer about an important concept that he refers to as neuro-poverty. When Heyer explains what he means by neuro-poverty, you'll recognize it as one of the central and recurring themes of this channel, which is the fact that there are billions of intellectually disadvantaged people in the world. If you happen to have been born smart and don't care about this, you are, in my opinion, a selfish asshole. If you happen to have been born smart and do care about this, you need to read Heyer's book and think deeply about it, no matter what side of the political spectrum you're on. The book has been widely acclaimed despite the fact that it touches on these very sensitive political issues. Heyer received his Ph.D. in psychology from the Johns Hopkins University. He's held teaching and research positions at the National Institute of Mental Health, the Medical School at Brown, and most recently at the University of California at Irvine. He's also served on the editorial board of various widely respected academic journals and was the guest editor for a special issue on brain imaging for the journal Intelligence. I could go on about his credentials, but I won't. Look him up. He's the real deal. As you'll see in our exchange, Heyer's very cautious as a scientist, but isn't afraid to talk about what the science says. And that's always laudable, in my opinion. If you disagree about anything in this exchange and would like to talk about it, send me a message. I'd love to have you on as a guest. This invitation is doubly extended if you're an academic or have published on this topic. As always, you'll find a timestamp in the video description, and my apologies for the sound and video lapses. Thanks for listening, and thanks for your continued support. Professor Heyer, welcome to A Theory of Everything, and thanks so much for doing this.
Well, thanks for inviting me.
Well, let's begin with your book. It's been a few years since you published it. Tell us about what has changed since then. What are your feelings about the book today?
Well, when I was first asked by Cambridge University Press to write a book called The Neuroscience of Intelligence, I was a little dubious because at the time, which was around 2013, there wasn't all that much neuroscience data about intelligence. There was neuroimaging data was beginning. There was genetic data. And those are the two main topics of the book I ultimately wrote. It came out in 2016, actually it came out in 2017. So it's for neuroscience, it's a little old, but I did talk about what the genetic story was at the time. I talked about what neuroimaging was finding. I actually had a paragraph about CRISPR, the genetic modification technology. And I said, this is very new, but keep an eye on this. It could be important. And sure enough, it turned out to be pretty important.
Yeah, I think that's an understatement. Yes, please continue.
So what's changed is the neuroimaging has gotten much, much more sophisticated and is discovering things about how brain connectivity is related to intelligence. There is the structural connectivity of how white matter connects different parts of the brain. And there's also functional connectivity about how information flows around the brain. And both functional and structural connectivity studies have focused on intelligence and problem solving and reasoning ability and found individual differences. You can, in my book, I noted a brand new study that had just come out just as I was finishing about using brain imaging to create what the authors called fingerprints of the brain, that were patterns of connectivity that were so unique to the individual, they were like fingerprints. And those patterns predicted things like IQ scores. So that was very exciting just as I was finishing the book. And now, 4 years later, there are now many, many studies of connectivity. And they continue to find interesting things about intelligence, kind of pinpointing the neural circuits that seem to underlie individual differences in intelligence. It is now possible to create a kind of score based on brain imaging that is correlated to IQ scores. In other words, you can begin now to predict IQ just from a brain image. And we still can't predict a lot of variance, but the fact that we can predict any is pretty amazing. And as the imaging gets more sophisticated, I'm sure that prediction is going to increase. In terms of genetics, we have moved from behavioral genetic studies of twins and adoptees, which pretty much established that there was some genetic influence on intelligence, to now a molecular genetic set of studies trying to identify specific genes that are related to intelligence. And it turns out there are lots of them, and each one contributes a tiny amount. So I wrote about this in the book, and now there are even more studies identifying more of these genes that have small relationships to intelligence, and how they work together is still the goal of finding out in this research. So things have progressed dramatically, but none of the currents that I wrote about neuroscience studies of intelligence, none have really been reversed or found to be wrong. There is progress. The progress is moving along. And the one area that we still don't see much progress is in neuroscience approaches to increasing intelligence. Not only no progress in neuroscience studies, no progress in any kind of study to increase intelligence. There is a lot of hubbub about this, a lot of claims in the media, but in fact, as far as I can tell, there is absolutely no evidence at all that any of these things will increase intelligence.
Well, you touched on
there's a summary of what I've done and how it's changed.
Okay, well, there you've touched on several very interesting and fascinating points. First of all, as you know, this is incredibly controversial amongst the general public. And can you say something about why that is the case and what you think your work or any unique contribution that your work can make to this debate or the conversation?
What do you think is so controversial in the public?
Well, the idea amongst the general public is, well, it depends on which side of the political spectrum you talk to. People on the left think that everybody is equal, and it's just a matter of giving everybody the same resources and the same opportunities, and you will inevitably come up with equal outcomes. People on the right, excuse me, people on the right, in contrast, believe that everything is up to the individual, that you can be very successful if you simply put in enough effort. So it's controversial depending on which side of the political spectrum you're on. In addition to this, making it even more complicated is the idea that the science strongly indicates that there are not only individual differences in intelligence, but also group differences and ethnic differences. So that's what I think about it.
Well, I will tell you that you've touched on a couple of different aspects of intelligence research. most intelligence research is not controversial in the public at all. And I know this, I've given innumerable public lectures on intelligence. The lectures are always met with curiosity and enthusiasm for understanding what the data show and what the data don't show. It's just as important to explain what the data don't mean as what the data do mean. And there is not very much confusion among the public on this, I have found. The real controversy is much greater in academia, where people believe more of a blank slate set of assumptions about social and cultural influences on intelligence. And if you're talking about life success, there are these left-right political ideas about, you know, you give people a chance, that's all government is supposed to do. If they fail, then the real divide is, do you provide a safety net for people who fail? Or do you say, hey, individuals are individuals, the government it's not the government's business if people fail. And so there's less interest in a safety net. And I'm personally more on the safety net side. But those controversies have little to do with the actual data on intelligence. Most people do not deny the evidence of everyday life, which is very clearly there are individual differences in ability to reason, to think clearly.
I think that's a really important point. I think most people in everyday conversation, they're willing to recognize that obviously some people are smarter than others, but then you get into the implications of that, and that's where the controversy begins. So please continue.
No, actually, I disagree with you. The implications are not so controversial as the causes. The causes
yes.
of the individual differences are the real, where the real controversy comes. And that's on one side, you have people that believe that all the causes of individual differences, and everyone understands it's not just one thing, there are going to be multiple causes. But on one hand, people believe very passionately that all the causes essentially are social or cultural. On the other hand, other people acknowledge there are social cultural influences, but there are also neurobiological and genetic influences. And that's where the controversies play out. And it's not so much that people like me who are interested in the genetics and neurobiology don't appreciate social and cultural things. We do, we understand it's a multi-determined complex trait, something like intelligence. But there are people who really want to deny any genetic aspect. And that's where it becomes difficult, because if you deny that there's any genetic aspect, then you have to explain why all the attempts for the last 50 years, all the earnest attempts at compensatory education, for example, now called early childhood education, they have all failed to raise IQ scores, essentially. My view is that's telling us something, and we have to understand the genetics of individual differences. Now, the real controversy, the incendiary controversy, comes in when you talk about average group differences on psychometric tests. And because some groups score higher than others, and some groups have consistently scored lower for decades, the controversy about what is the cause of that. Anything from systemic racism to bad parenting to weak social cultural norms. You have all kinds of explanations for that on the blank slate side of the equation. If you raise the idea that genetics might have something to do with it, you are instantly involved or embroiled in controversies about genetic determinism, and are some groups superior to others genetically? And this is a debate or a discussion that you cannot even have. It's not worth having, and it's not even relevant, because now we understand that genes are not deterministic. Genes are probabilistic. And the most ironic thing of all is, if you want to change some kind of trait, whether it is eye color or intelligence or extroversion, it might be easier, once you understand the neurobiology and the genetic aspect, to make a change than it is to change environmental things. Because so far, changing environment really doesn't, if you're a parent, you know that nothing in the environment will make your child more or less extroverted or more or less introverted. You may wind up with a spoiled brat extrovert, and the spoiled brat part comes from what you've done in raising the child. So these controversies are not really controversies over the data. The data are actually pretty clear. The implications
one thing that's very clear is that the controversy is definitely not in the science. Is that the case?
With the exception of group differences. It turns out that people who are experts in behavioral genetics feel very strongly that whatever genetic influences there may be on complex traits, there is no scientific technology to separate that out from the social, cultural, environmental interactions with gene function, that it's just too complicated a picture. And it's so complicated, you can't tease out what's, quote, genetic and what is, quote, environmental. And that's a very widespread feeling among the real experts in the field. Because I'm not an expert in the field, I have the luxury of taking a more optimistic view that someday, while what seems infinitely complex now will turn out to be less complex, and we'll figure it out. Now, this may happen long after I'm gone because it is complicated. But that's really the only controversy about whether or not it's so inherently complex, this genetic environmental interaction, that we'll never sort it out, or, well, technology gets better all the time, and go back 50 years to what seemed incredibly complex and beyond our imagination to resolve. And today it's, we know a lot about it. So I like to think 50 years into the future, we'll look back on this and we'll see, was it really so complicated that we still don't understand it? Or have we made important progress? And well, that's an interesting. We want to make the progress, by the way. The reason it's so important is to understand the genetics and the neurobiology, is because once you understand the complexity of those systems, there may be numerous points in this cascade of neurochemical events, from genes turning on and off to intelligent behavior. There's an awful lot in between. And there may be points where you can tweak the system, whether it's during brain development in childhood or even in utero. There may be points where you can tweak that system to have an outcome of increased intelligence. Now you get into a completely different discussion about if we can do that, should we? And these discussions are actually happening now in the context of this CRISPR technology, where there's now technology literally to edit genes and to create new genomes and to affect the human genome in ways that are passed on to the next generations. So we're having these conversations, and they're extraordinarily interesting and important. And intelligence is often mentioned in these discussions because it's a trait that most parents would choose if they had a choice. Most parents would choose to have children who are more intelligent. rather than less intelligent.
That's a very good point, Professor. May I interrupt here for a second? And your optimism here is interesting. However, is there any reason to believe that if the science of, or if our understanding of the genetic basis of intelligence increases, is there any reason to believe that the most intelligent people will forego this knowledge to let the less intelligent people take advantage of it?
It's not, it won't be up to the most intelligent people. It never is. I mean, society, especially free societies and democratic societies, have a range of people in decision-making capability or decision-making authority. Think about the United States Congress. They pass laws. You can have a pretty wide range of intellectual ability within the Congress. Half the Congress has said publicly they do not believe in evolution. Okay, where do you go from there? You know, I'm not too worried about the elites grabbing this for themselves. At least not in Western countries.
Okay, well, let me rephrase the question then. Is there any reason to believe that once our understanding of genes increases, that it will lessen the polarization, both social, genetic, political? Is there any reason to believe that it will only benefit the least intelligent people and not the most ambitious people?
That's, you know, that's kind of a social problem. I mean, imagine if there was an IQ pill and you could take this pill and it would raise your IQ score by 15 points. This is a standard deviation. This is a huge change. Would you take the pill?
That's a great question. And I think this is the problem. If this pill becomes available, what makes us think that the average person, not even going to the elites, the average person, 100 IQ or 115 IQ, what makes us think that they're not going to take it and they're going to let the people who are of different groups, different ethnicities, take the pill so that they can compete better with them?
I think you've answered your own question. I mean, everybody understands that all things being equal, which they are not, but all things being equal, more intelligence is better than less. And if you had the opportunity to increase your intelligence, most people would, as long as there are no side effects, as long as it's affordable. You know, there are caveats. But you could also say, I have two pills. This pill will increase your intelligence. This pill will increase your charisma. You can only have one. Which would you choose? Now, this is interesting. I've asked this in many of my public lectures, and among most of the public, most hands go up for the charisma pill. In academic audiences, all hands go up for the intelligence pill. What does this mean? I don't know. But if we are ever in the position as a society to have choices about increasing something like intelligence, as long as the choices are available to everyone equally, people will make their own choices. I would imagine everyone would want to have increased IQ. But
no, I think you're right. I think you're right. I think we don't differ on that. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
I also had imagined that no one would choose not to be vaccinated against COVID-19. So you should see the limits of my imagination here. So whereas virtually everyone I know would want increased intelligence, it's pretty presumptuous of me to think everyone might want that, even though to me it seems like a good idea. So does getting a vaccination seem like a good idea to me? yet this is not shared by large numbers of people. So I don't know. All I can do, as a scientist, now a retired scientist, is to work on solving the problem of what is it about some brains that make them smarter than other brains? And can we learn anything to help people, especially on the lower end of the distribution? And if by chance that will also influence people at the high end of the distribution, then that's a pretty interesting problem for society to have. And it is a problem to discuss and come up with policies, just like scientists are discussing limitations on the CRISPR technology.
Yes, very true. I think it's important to discuss these issues. One of the reasons that I focus on this topic and I give it such importance is precisely because I think there are really important implications for the future of the species. Because where you're optimistic about the science of genetics or the genetics of intelligence, we absolutely agree on the science. However, I don't see a reason. I'd like to see a reason. One of the reasons I asked the question is I'd like to believe that we have a reason to believe that once the science improves, that we'll use this to come together as a species. But I don't see any evidence for that. I see evidence of more polarization. I don't see, you asked a good question earlier. You said parents want their children to be more intelligent. So if you gave a group of 100 parents the option to have their children take a pill to be more intelligent, who's going to say no? They're all going to say yes. And what that effect will have is to polarize those children even more than they are now. I don't see any reason scientifically to believe that it'll narrow the bell curve. I think there's many reasons to believe it'll widen the bell curve.
That is certainly possible. It's certainly possible. And but that's not a scientific issue. That is a social, political, cultural issue. And we have to have solutions that are social, political, and cultural. For example, I have warmed to the idea of a universal basic income, because this will help people on the lower end of the intelligence distribution who, through no fault of their own, do not have the mental skills and abilities to hold jobs that are high-paying jobs.
That's such an important idea. That's really, really important. And may I pause very quickly to recommend to people to really focus on this, read his book, because this is the central idea of the famous bell curve. This is the same central idea. It has a different concept. It's 4 decades or 3 decades later, but it's the same concern about the people who are least intelligent. Please continue with this. I think it's very, very important, Professor.
Well, in the book, I coined the term neuro-poverty to be deliberately a hard and uncomfortable concept, that to the extent to which some aspects of poverty are strongly related to having a lower IQ or fewer mental abilities, and to the extent to which intelligence has a genetic component, then some aspects of poverty can be traced back to that genetic component. Not all aspects, we don't know how much, but this is what I mean by neuro-poverty, is that proportion of the causes of poverty that are rooted in the genetic aspects of intelligence. And for example, there are 53 million people in the United States that have IQs under 85.
That's mind-boggling. That's mind-boggling, yes.
Now, for those of your listeners who don't, I would imagine most of your viewers do not know someone with an IQ under 85 and do not know them or do not know them well, unless it might be a family member. And it is very hard to imagine what life is like for somebody with an IQ of 80. Everyday problem solving that you and I take for granted is really difficult if you have an IQ of 80. Now, I want to very quickly add, there is nothing inherently wrong with having an IQ of 80. It doesn't make you lesser of a person. Having a higher IQ does not make you a better person. It doesn't make you a kinder person. There are wonderful people at all aspects of the IQ range. I have worked in medical schools for 40 years. I've been surrounded by very bright people. Some of them you would not want to bring home to your family. They are rotten people. They are miserable. They are dishonest. Vast majority are not. But what the point is, in every aspect of the range of intelligence, you have the full range of human personality and the full range of honesty and so on. But the point I wanted to make is, in the United States, in addition to having 53 million people with lower IQ under 85, by the way, the cutoff for the US military is around 85. It won't take anybody that's lower. We have 53 million people in that category. We also have about 41 million people who live below the poverty line, as defined economically. So the question is, what is the overlap between the 41 million people who live in poverty and the 53 million people with lower IQ? I'm not saying that people in poverty have low IQ, but I'm saying there's some overlap there. If you could raise IQ for everybody, you would automatically alleviate some of the social problems associated with poverty. You would lift people out of poverty. Of course, that's one way to lift people out of poverty. The other is to education and better wages, but education and better wages are indirectly related to intelligence, which has a genetic component. This is what I mean by neuro-poverty. By the way, in anticipation of talking with you, I looked up Spain. And in Spain, there are roughly, out of the 47 million people in Spain, you have roughly 7.5 million people with IQs under 85. That's a lot of people.
Sure, it's a lot of people.
And there are a lot of society problems like chronic unemployment and all the society problems that go with it and personal problems that go with it. This is one of the reasons I'm warming to the universal basic income, because people need help. I don't ascribe to the sink or swim idea of society. I do believe there's a social contract, and I do believe governments have a responsibility to provide safety nets, and especially for people who, through no fault of their own, it's not a question of not working hard, they just do not have the mental skills and abilities for whatever reason.
These are so important. These ideas are so important, Professor. I know that we had a scheduling mix-up today, and once again I apologize for that. I know you also have another commitment, so maybe we'll be lucky enough to have you on again in the future to expand on these topics, which again I think are so important. Can you very quickly tell us where people can follow your work and your book and your appearances?
Well, I'm on Twitter, RJ Hire, but I don't really post a lot of I don't have new things now because I'm retired, but I post a lot of links to other research about intelligence. The book you can find on Amazon, it's called The Neuroscience of Intelligence. I have a new edited book coming out that is more for professionals on the cognitive the neuroscience of intelligence and cognition, cognitive neuroscience. And
Okay.
I don't have the title right, but that's coming out, Cambridge University Press, I think before the end of the year. I have a textbook that I hope will be coming out by the end of this year called The Science of Human Intelligence with my Spanish colleague, Roberto Colom. I think those are the best ways to keep up with things. The book is, I was just looking at the book just before we talked. It's still a good introduction to this topic for people who want a non-technical explanation of what intelligence is, what the genetic and neuroimaging shows, and why it's all important.
I agree with you. I'm going to close with a final comment about the difference between the bell curve and your book. I think the bell curve is such a massive book and it's overwhelming. Most people don't even read it. But if you'd really like to catch up on the latest science of intelligence, I highly recommend the book because it's just a wonderful book and it's a very relatively simple to read. Professor,
Okay,
once again, thanks so much for doing this. I hope we can touch base again sometime in the future.
Well, I'll tell you what, let's see what the reaction is to some of the things I've said, see what your viewers have to say, and then maybe we can do it again and address some of those comments.